The views and opinions expressed on the Nova Society are those of the panelists and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Phoenix Research Institute or any institution which any panel member is associated. Reproduction or dissemination other than for the purpose of education or information without the express written permission of the Phoenix Research Institute or Nova Society Media is strictly prohibited.
I'd like to welcome everyone back to the Nova Society. I'm Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and I'm here with my very special guest, Frank Schaeffer, who is a New York Times best-selling author of Keeping Faith, Crazy for God, and over a dozen fiction and nonfiction books, a religious reform activist, guest commentator on The Readout on MSNBC with Joy Reid, and has been a frequent guest of Rachel Maddow and Christiane Amanpour, sought after for his perspective on national and world news events. Frank is the host of In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on YouTube and Apple Podcasts, and his cultural commentary series, It Has to Be Said, which can be seen at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And, of course, Dr. Mark Bound and Dr. Scott Gershwer are here today. Today we're going to be talking with Frank about cultism, Christian nationalism, and rejecting fanaticism, a return to objective reality, and strengthening the sane middle. Frank, shall we begin with discussing how we might return to objective reality, particularly as you and I were speaking before we began, when AI and the alternative facts and exactly what objective reality is can be so extremely difficult to determine?
Okay, so the objective reality thing comes up in lots of ways. And I know we talk about technology and AI and conspiracism and all the rest of this, QAnon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there's a long history in America of going to non-objective reality all the way back to the Bay State. You know, this is the land God gave us, and so we can kill the Native Americans. That's non-objective reality, superstition, and all the rest. But right now, we have some interesting examples that aren't usually cited that kind of, I think, underline what the real problem is. And that is on the right, we have people, for instance, in the Project 2025, where there's a preponderance of far right-wing Roman Catholics that even in the 16th century in France, during the civil war between Protestants and Catholics, they would have been part of the extreme branch that wanted to make war on the Protestants and kill them. Opus Dei comes out of Spain during the Franco era, when Franco was hounding and executing enemies, and they've gone back into a superstitious-based political reality that really bears no resemblance to even post-Enlightenment reality or science on one hand. And then on the other hand, we have these guys like Elon Musk, who tweeted after the debate between Harris and Trump about the debate and the fact that right afterwards, a famous singer had endorsed her. He said, "Oh, I'll give you a child." And I was thinking, of course, you know, that sounds like rape. It sounds like coercion. It sounds like something droit de seigneur back in the 14th century in Europe, when someone who is in a position of power was able to take the virginity of somebody because, you know, they were just a peasant. And it recalled to me anyway, the fact that there's another level of unreality right now where we have a whole class of very wealthy people, billionaires, who have taken advantage of the capitalist system to the nth degree, who have actually changed their brains, because we know that brains are malleable, and now genuinely believe in their heart of hearts that they are a gift to humanity, to the point where Elon Musk, for instance, using IVF, hitting up on people who work for him, has at least 12 children, all of whom have been embryonically tested in most cases to make sure he's getting the perfect child using high technology. And so they've gone to another planet where they kind of already rule us and are so insensitive to most people that he can say, "I'll give you a child and take care of your cats," to a rock star who signs off a pop star, childless cat lady. And somehow he thinks he's going to be able to say this and no one will take it in, amiss. And so, when I see that and I realize that you've got these guys, for instance, what's been happening with, there was an article in the New York Times the other day, the world as it isn't ready for what comes after IVF. And that's just September 9, talking about all these billionaires who suddenly are tinkering with all these new fertility technologies, not because they're interested in science, but because they themselves want to leave perfect progeny behind. And they're into this genetic testing, IVF fertilization, not because they can't have a baby, but because they're into this high-tech vision of what the future ought to be, which turns out to be their own kind of clones. So I just think when you look at the kind of elitism that Donald Trump evokes and that Elon Musk does when he says that Taylor Swift, he tells her, I'll give you a child and take care of your cats, that kind of insult. That, by the way, back in British literature of the 19th century, the old vernacular would have been, he should have been horsewhipped within an inch of his life on the steps of his club by, say, her brother or anybody who was an honorable male. These guys just go there and there's no ramification whatsoever. So one of the unrealities we're facing right now is this elite group of conservative Roman Catholics like Amy Coney Barrett on the court and the people in Project 2025 at Heritage, Donald Trump, who thinks he's above the law and acts that way. And they're in an area of unreality, and I'll stop this in just a second, on two levels. First of all, their political view sets them above everybody else. But I would like to say that we have a group of people who really suffer from the same sort of mental disability and derangement that European royalty did for centuries, in which you become the king of France at age 4, you're bred to the position, you've never known anything else, and you live in this bubble. And then all of a sudden, the peasants are at the gate and they're marching you off to the guillotine. And it comes as somewhat of a surprise because you really weren't living in the real world. You're in this bubble. So, Musk and so many of these guys building themselves bunkers, having their sperm tested, matched with eggs of people they're impregnating by the dozens. This is a weirdness. Speaking of Wolf saying the Republicans are weird, there's a level of weird disconnect here, which puts people like me in a bind to even describe it anymore. It's sort of a combination of Mad Magazine and The Onion taken to a different degree that you can't even find ways to say, did this really happen? Okay, that's way too long of an answer, but that's kind of my vision of unreality these days.
Thank you. Marcus Scott. I was thinking actually about what Trump was saying about immigrants eating dogs, and David Muir coming in and trying to say that there was no evidence, that the commissioner or the mayor or whoever it was had said, well, there was no evidence, and Trump was saying, oh, I saw it on TV. And so as to Frank's point, what objective reality actually is.
Oh, wow. That's above my pay grade. But, I will say this. I don't know that we could do another 4 years of somebody who gets their information from sources that Trump gets his information from. And it's not an isolated case. I mean, Trump was president of the United States, had the greatest intelligence gathering firm in the world at his disposal, and went to Twitter and got and probably 4chan and Reddit to get his information. And that's just downright scary.
Yeah. And last night when he's asked for verification of people eating cats and dogs who are invading our country, he says, well, I saw it on TV. I mean, it's like you couldn't write that as a comedy line on a Saturday Night Live open and get a laugh, because it would just be too on the nose. It's too stupid for words. And there we are. And
some Republicans this morning blamed it on the fact that he attended the debate with Lisa Loomer, who's a lunatic birther, whatever, from Florida, who flew up to Philadelphia, I guess, with him, or arrived with him in Philadelphia, and has a head full of demons and nonsense and all kinds of things like that. And so they want to blame it on her. But, hey, look, the buck stops there.
Yeah. And if he didn't have the discipline to do more than 8 minutes before he veered into his weirdness, I mean, how long would he be talking to Vladimir Putin about Western Europe before he'd be off the rails too? How would you trust him to do anything?
Yeah, I sense that that's a one-sided conversation anyway. It's Vladimir Putin talking and Trump listening.
Well, his mind would be wandering to some girl he had just looked up her skirt when she came down the ramp off the airplane. But to the degree he'd hear what Putin was saying.
And we're talking about reality here. And the unfortunate thing in society today is that reality has become subjective. And I think that's really what the problem was. The problem is with our society today is that it's subjective by who you listen to, and by how you view society and how you view the world around you. And I think a lot of this comes down to accountability. Now, you're going to hear an awful lot from surrogates from the Republican side who are going to say, well, wait a minute, they fact-checked Trump more than they did last night, than they did Kamala Harris. Well, if you're the guy lying all the time, that's the guy you're going to be fact-checking. That's kind of the way it works.
Yeah.
And if you closed your eyes and just took some of the things that were said last night, and again, this is again going back to a reality, and you were at Thanksgiving dinner and you closed your eyes and didn't know this wasn't your uncle, who everybody dreads coming to the dinner table on Thanksgiving, was there absolutely rambling and was probably drunk with what we would think the uncle was, and was saying incoherent things, and presented an idea of a reality that you can't make this stuff up.
Yeah.
But he can. And I think that's the scary part right there, is we can make this up and people buy into it, because if you make him accountable, if you challenge him, if you challenge anything that's being said that you disagree with, if it's outside of your echo chamber, if it's outside of, your comfort zone, your zero-sum ideology of what reality is, that's where the argument starts. And unfortunately, I always go back to Bonhoeffer. It's Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity. Yeah. You cannot argue with logic to make this work. Now, tonight, I'm going to be, at my usual time, I'm going to go down to the local pub and sit there. And I'm here in South Carolina. I'm going to guarantee you there's a whole bunch of Trumpettes sitting in that room. But then again, we all get along. It's fine. But the fact is they're going to parrot back all of this stuff, regardless of how against true abject reality it is. And it's because, and I've always said this, we live in an information society today where information is available. Unfortunately, probably 70% of that information is wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of what is wrong with it is there's no historical context. The other day I did a commentary that I think got your attention, because when you invited me to come talk to you, we were talking about what's going on with Project 2025. And the thing is, what I brought to that was some historical perspective. I was talking with my podcast producer from In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, Ernie Gregg, and he was asking me, how would you put your thumb on what is wrong? What is the base of the base of the base of this departure from reality? And of course, the catch-all is lack of education, but more than that, it's the basic American antipathy from its founding to history. We don't want to know where we came from. We don't want to know where our wealth came from in the South with slaveholders. We don't want to know where our land came from that we occupy, that we took from Native Americans. There's a willful amnesia in the US, and it applies to these smaller issues like what is Project 2025. No one wants to talk about the fact that this is a 50-year-old project. The groundwork was laid by people like Richard Don Newhouse, who was a conservative convert from being a Lutheran priest to Catholicism. And he had a real a real bee in his bonnet about this. I knew Richard back in the day. He asked me to write articles for First Things magazine when he started it, because I was on the religious right sidekick and nepotistic sidekick to my father, Francis Schaeffer, who was this well-known evangelical activist. And people like him, the Knights of Columbus, Opus Dei, Archbishop Fulton Sheen, who I met with a number of times in New York, Bill Buckley, who started the National Review, who knew my father quite well, and who I met a couple of times. These guys were laying the groundwork for something, both for heritage and other right-wing activities. And this is 50, 60 years ago. And it isn't a conspiracy, but all too often the media, even the kind of knowledge class, New York Times type media, very rarely says, this isn't a news item that happened yesterday. Project 2025 doesn't come out of a vacuum. It comes out of a 50-year project that produced Amy Coney Barrett. It produced the list from the Federalist Society that was given to Donald Trump by Ralph Reed and Franklin Graham, also evangelical activists who I know personally from the past, who said to him, we can bring you millions of votes, but what we care about is overturning Roe v. Wade, and here are the people who would do it. And it wasn't just the Supreme Court, it was the federal bench all the way down the line. So, I think the lack of interest in history, even on the left and in the Democratic Party, it's all about what happened last night. It's not about where did this really come from. I think one of the strengths of the right wing, as opposed to the left wing in the United States, is that the right wing has had an incredible staying power to start projects and finish them, and has had a kind of a sense that in the end, culture wars can be won if you just stay with the program. You just keep getting up, adopting your plan. So if you look, for instance, at Heritage, and you look at the Federalist Society, those two have run in tandem from the beginning. And I've known the people involved in those from the beginning. And what you've got now is not some newfound thing. The only reason we didn't have a Project 2025 before is they never had a hope of actually dictating the terms of how one White House would function. They didn't do this during the first term of Trump because they weren't that close to it. But they took a pattern, they took a template from the evangelicals like Ralph Reed and Franklin Graham, and they've copied it because Ralph Reed and Franklin Graham got close enough with Paula White and these other evangelical leaders. They couldn't get everything they wanted, but they got Trump to overturn Roe v. Wade. I mean, that is so huge that by itself, that would be enough. These guys say, okay, aha, now we can do the same thing with contraceptives, gay rights, any kind of racial integration legislation, voting rights, and they've gone down the whole list, including taxes and Social Security, Medicare, and all the rest, everything that they don't like about FDR's program, that they're still hammering away at, let alone, Obamacare and so forth. But it's not like somehow the right wing reacts faster. It's that they have laid long-term plans. And now literally, and this really is conspiratorial for real, this is not going off to some other planet, members of Opus Dei who have belonged to this secretive society for years, that was established in Franco's regime in Spain to round up priests and others they disagreed with and execute them. You would think, okay, that's it. Just like when Hillary Clinton was running, I was thinking, okay, she'll win. And at last, I won't get any more calls from MSNBC saying, explain these evangelicals to me, and I can live out the rest of my life just writing my books and doing what I want to do, painting and writing and being a grandfather, because that's done now. The culture war has been lost by the right. It's over. And then, at about 2 a.m, watching that clock on the New York Times graph tip toward Trump, it was like, I know exactly what's going to happen, being personal and selfish about this. No get out of jail card. I'm going to be spending the rest of my life talking about this shit because here we are again. But the reason we were back was not because of Trump. It's because people like Ralph Reed and Franklin Graham, and now the Heritage and the Federalist Society and Project 2025, they always have the self-discipline to lay the next step and be ready for, they are opportunists, but they work on a long-term project. And now that's what Project 2025 is. It's their wish list. And I'll just finish by saying, back in the day, I was working with my father, Francis Schaeffer, and Dr. C. Everett Koop, who went on to be Surgeon General. And we made the series, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, that along with the book is credited by most historians of the history of the pro-life movement with being the beginning of the evangelical wing of the pro-life movement. 2 things I'd like to mention that sometimes people don't think of. One, our battle was not with the, quote, secular humanists and Planned Parenthood. Our battle was with mainstream evangelicals like the Reverend Billy Graham, the evangelist, Dr. Criswell of Dallas, who was pastor of First Baptist in Dallas, president of Baptist Theological Seminary in Dallas, and head of the Southern Baptist movement at that time. They were pro-choice. Most people don't realize that. We had to fight to turn our leaders into pro-life fanatics because they thought they were following Jesus and they should be nice to everybody, and that includes women, and why should we dictate to them? That's what the Reverend Billy Graham told Dad and I when we met with him. He was in the Methodist Hospital and Mayo Clinic undergoing some tests. My father was getting chemotherapy in St. Mary's. And we went across the street and sat down and talked with him and begged him to get into, quote, our movement, which was the beginning of the anti-abortion movement for the evangelical side. And we had just met with Fulton Sheen in New York. Well, I had, because my dad was ill. And Fulton had introduced me to Richard John Newhouse and the Knights of Columbus. Knights of Columbus put about $250,000 into that film project. These guys knew what they wanted, and some of them were part of Opus Dei. And so basically that's 50 years ago. And now it's all, Project 2025 is their wish list. And the second point I wanted to make that doesn't get mentioned once is back in the day, Ronald Reagan would meet with us. Bush would meet with us. My mother stayed often with Betty Ford in the White House because Mike Ford had lived in our house in my dad's ministry of Libre Fellowship. But we were outsiders. In other words, they would throw us and the evangelicals we represented a sop, as it were. Oh, we'll make Coop Surgeon General, or we'll meet with you in the White House, half an hour, or a handwritten note from one of the Bush family to me, or to my mom when my dad died, whatever it might be. But we weren't insiders. When the door shut, they got on with the regular business of government. Ronald Reagan wasn't a pro-lifer. He was pro-choice. He just had to say what he had to say to get the vote. Big difference today. These guys, including the Project 2025 people, they aren't just insiders. They are running the system because Trump has no ideas. He's this vacuous, empty shell of a mentally ill man, on top of that being aged and demented. And into that shell, you can pour anything. Where did they learn this? From the evangelicals who did it to him. He's pro-choice. How many pregnancies has he fostered over the years that have ended in abortion? They're probably countless. And not only that, he was pro-choice vocally. So they saw that, and it's like, okay, next time he's in office, God willing, he gets back there, we're not going to come unprepared. We have a 990-page document ready to go, and that's Project 2025. And I'm only 72 years old, and this history is only 50 years old. But when you look at Fulton Sheen, Opus Dei, and all these other guys, this didn't come out of nowhere. So our wish list back in those days has become now the de facto Republican platform. That's where we're at.
And I just will say that there was actually a Project 2017, and that Trump enacted almost 65% of it in 2017, mostly by executive orders. And there was a Project 2021, which obviously never happened because he didn't win the White House. When they say that, it was there for Biden to take as well, Biden didn't take them up on it, but certainly Trump would rubber stamp almost anything that he thought would get him ahead in some way, or a good, or a attaboy even. I mean, at this point, he's so addled that it really seems like a little praise is enough for him.
Yeah. And of course, the only thing that's different now is that unlike those elections, he's literally trying to stay out of prison. So that the level of desperate flailing and insanity that you see, the literal almost frothing at the mouth, is his fear of actual jail time, significant prison time as a felon. And so now it's really no holds barred. And so there are, throw out all rule books, say whatever you say that comes into your head at that moment. And of course, what that does is further give permission to the radical fringe, although it's not the fringe anymore, it's the heart of the Republican Party. And the only thing I wanted to add to what you guys were saying before is, to me, the big story is not why are these evangelicals supporting him, because I know why. They've decided that he's God's gift and that it's part of prophecy being fulfilled, and we're going to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, blah, blah, blah. I get all that. But, what remains a mystery to me is the Republican establishment, because I knew people like Bob Dole and Jack Kemp, and they're gone now. But the people who sort of followed them, it's unimaginable to me that they're sitting there with someone talking about arresting his opponents and putting them in prison. This kind of gone off to this another level. Elon Musk's billions behind him because he doesn't want to have Starlink and his other projects regulated. And I think the dearth of Republicans who have stood up, I mean, there's Dick Cheney saying he'll vote for Kamala Harris, but other than here and there, a few people, the party itself still in thrall. And so I think, if you were talking about unreality and moral bankruptcy, I don't know how you would put it, but to me, Trump is the footnote. The real thing is what's the big story between the whole Republican Party going for him? Just like in Germany, the big story of 1938, is not the Nazis. The big story at that point is how many, quote, ordinary Germans in the Lutheran Church and the business community went with them. So, when you see Elon Musk ready to hook his wagon to this for whatever reasons, or the Republican Party ready to go along with even this stage of the crashing and burning of the Trump candidacy, it really makes your head spin. At least me, it makes my head spin.
Well, I think there's a reason why conservatism has not died. And one of it is because it's Republicans are pretty much a unified group.
Yeah.
Democrats have always been a coalition.
Yeah.
coalition of different groups.
Yeah.
They don't always agree with everything that that comes out. Now, I will, for the purpose of total transparency, I'm a Roman Catholic. I'm also a member of the Knights of Columbus, a fourth degree. That does not mean that I'm an Opus Dei. And I
Sure,
think
no.
you'll find that a lot of people within that group, we just do it simply for charity. That's what we're
Yeah.
doing it for, simply the charity purposes. Are there people in there that are the fanatics? Absolutely. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And a friend of mine who passed away back in 2017, Michael Novak, who was an author and was a professor, and I knew him fairly well.
Yeah.
His argument about society is that people did not understand what really these things like social justice. We did not understand social justice.
Yeah.
And I was the first one to say, when I was approached about writing a couple of courses for social justice, my comment to the university was, tell me what you're defining it as, because it has never been defined by my field, sociology. It has never been defined. It is this sort of nebulous thing that depends on who you are. One of the things that was brought up was Charlottesville. Those people that were walking with the tiki torches, they will argue that they were going for social justice, their social justice. The protesters against them will say that they were going. Now, if you've got two totally diametrically different opposing ideologies, both claiming it's for social justice, there's a problem with the idea of social justice. So Mike Novak tried to put this into terms of religion.
Yeah.
And he loved to quote St. Thomas Aquinas. He'd love to quote those old scholars from Catholic history as the foundation of what today's society should consider social justice.
Yeah.
Even as a Roman Catholic, having grown up into the faith, I do note that it took the Roman Catholic Church 500 years to basically forgive Galileo Galilei because he was right. I also know that if a rule was made back in the 16th century, it probably is something we should look at again.
Yeah.
So when you get somebody that is, and again, Mike Novak was a very smart guy. I mean, Michael Novak was a very, very smart guy, and he was very convincing. As I say, he was an author, he was a professor, he was a speaker, a lecturer, but he could make the case. But he had this ability to make the case to the audience he was talking to. He was not sitting around talking to a bunch of Jewish people.
Yes.
He was sitting around talking to a bunch of Catholics.
Yeah.
Or a bunch of Lutherans, or on that which I consider Catholic light. He was talking to those people, and that created that echo chamber. People were hearing what they wanted to hear because it fit with their narrative. And when you're doing these lectures and when you're doing these statements like this, the problem is, once again, there's no accountability. Nobody is coming up and challenging those ideas. And if you did, woe be you, because they would have booed you off the stage, even though you're making a legitimate argument as far as a counterpoint to the points being made. And I think that is one of the reasons why conservatism has moved so far to the right, almost to the idea of fascism, in my mind, because they are a unified group. That's an advantage to them. The disadvantage is they're a smaller group. There are more registered Democrats in the United States than there are Republicans. Got to get those coalitions together to make Democrats successful moving forward.
Yeah, and the fact that the Republicans are a minority party means they keep flirting with things that look mightily like apartheid to me. I lived in South Africa in the mid-1980s when I made a shitty movie out there that was for a Hollywood couple action pictures because the locations were cheap. But it was interesting to me because the year there really stuck in my mind, and a few years later, Nelson Mandela was released. But essentially it was the white people that I knew who were even against apartheid. It was like a finger in the dike. They were scared to question anything because there's no middle ground once you let that go. And the Republicans understand they're a minority and they support minority views that are wildly unpopular. And so they have to tell themselves that the opposition, is somehow demonic. And these evangelical groups, especially on the Pentecostal side, not the Roman Catholics, obviously, but the evangelical Pentecostals, all that, the holiness movement and so forth. They've really adapted that language. So people like Paula White, who, by the way, is a charlatan and a flake and totally cut from the Trump cloth, but pretends to be a believer, etc., taking advantage of these things for monetary reasons and power and so forth. But the language they are now speaking, they probably don't know this, but it's literally lifted from the Inquisition. In other words, these are heretics, these are demon-possessed, their enemies are demon-possessed now. And it's a spiritual battle. It's no longer a political battle. And of course, it's ironic because when you look at somebody like Michael Novak or Bill Buckley, or Fulton Sheen for that matter, or Richard Don Newhouse, all these other guys are the people that I knew who were not in Opus Dei, but Catholics of the old order, traditional conservatives, liberal conservative, whatever you might call it. They were never into that kind of language. In other words, when Bill Buckley sat down with somebody on firing line and talked to him as a conservative Roman Catholic talking to a well-known author or composer, or conductor, whatever it might be, he came in as a cultural equal with a base of knowledge and would acknowledge the same reality that they did. So he could disagree without calling someone demon-possessed and basically preparing them for the pyre if they lost the culture wars or the next election. These guys have gone to the next step, and they've found a guy in Donald Trump who says literally, we should round up and kill our enemies. We should deport them. He's talking about things that sound like assassination of opponents, certainly jail time. This isn't the language of the Roman Catholics that I've ever known in my life in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. This is a completely different thing. And they've lost control of the narrative. So, if you can fault people like Fulton Sheen and Newhouse and Buckley, it isn't that they wanted this, or even Archbishop Lefebvre in France, who I met a couple of times when he came to see my father, who was against the change of the Vatican from the Latin Mass into the vernacular. None of these guys were shilling for fascism. They were of a completely different order. They are the people who gave us St. Mary's Hospital in Mayo Clinic and all these other hospitals names for saints. As I sometimes quip, there are very few St. Darwin hospitals. I mean, the great saints of secularism, Huxley, whomever, don't have hospitals named after them. It's the Roman Catholic social justice people that all do in the end and have. So, one of the things that makes me really sad as a former evangelical and a friend of people like Sheen and Newhouse back in the day was that they did not foresee what would happen to their movement any more than my father did, even though he was ardently anti-abortion. He would not have figured 50 years into the process, you'd have people who were part of Opus Dei writing a program that would essentially kick everybody out of the US government. It was not a lick-spittle, butt-kissing Trump fanatic and destroy our whole federal system. I mean, this was not what they were looking for. So I think one of the tragedies is the unintended consequences. And of course, that's the way all of history is written. It's not just this, but maybe it's not said enough about our present circumstance, at least from my perspective of having been a fly on the wall at some of these meetings.
It's interesting how what began as grievances has now turned into a blood feud or a vendetta. Yeah. And you have Bill Barr, who is not a member of Opus Dei, but is ardent Catholic and was on the board of the Catholic Information Center, which is a pretty radically Catholic group, writing an article back in the day talking about how homosexuals get so much attention and they're like 1% to 2% of the population, but Catholics, who are 25% of the population, can't get the time of day from people. And that grievance grows as time goes on and he gains more power. And ends up with him, clearing out the square, and ends up with him having a secret police force rounding up people in Portland and so on. So it's getting kind of scary there, and it probably would be a lot more scary if Trump was a better debater.
And we will continue this conversation with Frank Schaeffer in our next episode. We hope you join us. So that's all the time we have for today's episode. The Nova Society is a production of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our sponsor for this week's episode, the Phoenix Research Group, an independent research consortium offering social issue solutions to NGOs and international government agencies through multidisciplinary, nonpartisan, and unbiased research. We'd also like to thank our podcast partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, our editing partners, Podkite, who does all our analytics, iHeartRadio, where people get their music and podcasts, Apple iTunes, the largest source of music and podcasts on the internet, Spotify, the most popular source for the Nova Society. The Nova Society is available on all these and other quality platforms mentioned in our description. We'd like to thank our listeners. Without you, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a comment, a question, or would like to be a guest on the Nova Society, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. Always remember, the power of society is knowledge. So for Dr. Scott Gershwer, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Be well, and we hope to see you again next time.